The incident occurred in a McDonald's drive-thru after work at around 1 a.m., and several have reported seeing human remains, murder scenes, or other strange sights. I was 19. Between my car and the McDonald's, a random homeless man with a beer says, "Hey, there's a house on fire over there." He was muttering something else, so I didn't take his word for it. He was driving down a nearby street when he noticed flames coming from a house. The roof was popping, but I pounded on the windows and door to see if anyone was inside. I ended up having to, as they pulled the homeowner out onto the lawn in front of me. They stayed and wrote a witness report after 5 or 10 minutes of CPR. The officer informed me that the man had died. At the time, I don't think I would have been able to deal with the idea that he would still be alive if I had arrived 10 minutes sooner. I hope you're all right. I'm not sure that helps. The man who told me would have needed more than 10 minutes to walk from where he saw it anyway. We don't know when the fire started, and since it was dark and there were no visible flames, it was difficult to determine that the house was on fire. I worked as a cook for a time, and many people came and went from the area where I worked. I had a basement with a walk-in refrigerator, freezer, time clock, office storage, and a bathroom. It was cool in the summer and a good spot to take a quick break. One of my team members hurried down to use the restroom during a dinner rush. As we were busy, 5 minutes pass, then 10. Where is it? The first thing that springs to mind is him urinating. You don't poop during dinner. Rule 1. Second, he left, which is typical during everyone has their breaking point, but this guy didn't. So I ran down during a little lull. This happens when the dining room is packed and all of the orders arrive at once, but nobody leaves the tables, and the way it goes, you're not preparing anything. Everyone is fed until a table opens up and the next person places their order. I go check, but the bathroom door is locked and not responding. I was visiting my grandfather one summer, and I knew what it was before we ever opened it. He OD'd that awful night, and I believed he was getting clean. He had a baby at home. Drugs are awful. When I went for a walk along the piers that jutted into the Hudson River one day in the late 1950s, in Hoboken, New Jersey, I noticed a dead man's body floating in the water close to Holland America Line's pier. I flagged down a police cruiser. Was a police officer from Hudson County. I showed him the body, and he used a police phone box and a telephone pole to tell me to leave. I retreated and hid behind a pile of pallets, and 3 more officers and a fire chief arrived. After that, a hook, before they could launch the boat, a New York City police boat arrived, and they removed the body from the river. He was swollen and had a chain around him, and a ladder and a fire van arrived with a rowboat on the roof racks. It had a car rim fastened to it. The police broke the chain when the firefighters lowered bolt cutters to them using a rope. The police then lowered a Stokes basket and placed the body inside. The firefighters lifted it and placed the victim on the dock, after which the chain and rim were lifted. A man wearing a badge took pictures of the man. An ambulance arrived, loaded the body onto a stretcher, and then left. A police officer placed the chain and rim in the trunk of a police car. After that, everyone went. In September, my teacher assigned us a task on how I had spent the summer. I wrote about the deceased man, and she gave me AB. I believe you have the dates untrue. In a recent post, you claim to be almost 70 years old. If you take that to be true, you would be 69 years old in 2022, which is 1953. You also claim that this was in your late 50s, make you 6 if it occurred in 1959. Did you flag down a police car when you were 6 years old? Did you go on a solo walk at 6? It was 1959, and I was 7 years old, a street child. We didn't have video games. So either you learned life quickly or it consumed you completely. The police car was a black and white 58 Ford. The ambulance was a gray and white Cadillac SNS. And the New York City police boat was green and white. New York hadn't gone blue and white yet. I haven't had an uneventful life, so I left out a lot of things. However, the officer who took the pictures was named Angelo. I didn't mention the 2 rats that scurried past my feet when I was hiding behind the pallet stack, or how the officers cracked jokes and laughed about the dead. Perhaps I should have mentioned more, The teacher had nearly every student read their report aloud to the class, but I had one that was far longer than everyone else's. So my grandfather was upset that I didn't leave when the policeman told me to. I considered replying about the neighbor I discovered hanging in his backyard. A few weeks later in '59, or about getting puppies, chickenpox, beach vacations, and fishing with Grandpa, but my first wife threw away everything I owned. The floater was far less graphic than the man I witnessed jump in front of a commuter train. Passing through Hackensack, New Jersey, in 1962, I had visited a town in northeast India, and it had been pouring mercilessly for the last week or so, and the river behind the villages had overflowed, washing away many houses. Fortunately for my family, our home was on a hill, so on one of these days, I was gazing out the window and I was unable to approach the water for about a year, after seeing a floating human corpse that was bloated and coated in water in the flooded river below. I'm receiving a lot of comments claiming that the deceased was given a water burial, which is incorrect. Additionally, the flood was caused by the Brahmaputra River, which swept away homes and animals, leaving many defenseless people in its wake. I was unfortunate enough to see one of them, demonstrating how few people are aware that hundreds of people are killed by terrible floods that occur throughout northeast India. Water hyacinths are also not gorgeous. Flowers are long, wetland plants that proliferate in water, and it is challenging to free yourself if you swim into them carelessly. You mean that the water hyacinths, not the flowers. Something that still bothers me is that they have long, weedy stems, and they are dangerous to approach since you can't swim out if you get caught in them. It's not suspicious, but I thought the facility got away with. I worked with a new patient who had a hip replacement and was younger than 60. She complained of severe thigh discomfort and was unable to do any physical therapy that day. So I asked her if she had discussed the pain with the nurse or doctor, and she replied that she had, as she was still at risk for blood clots in her legs due to the length of time since her operation. I took notice of her discomfort and told the nurses that she might have a clot, but they dismissed it because she was a challenging patient and didn't want to participate in therapy. I arrived the following morning before the other patients were up. A staff member informed me that she had died the previous night. She was still in the room I wasn't meant to be in, but I walked in, held her hand, and apologized for not pressing for her to be checked out. Ever since then, I have been outspoken about what patients should demand if they have unresolved issues, and I make sure to thoroughly record my meetings with personnel in case of wrongful death laws. You'd is brought, edit. Thank you all for the support. It was quite distressing and weighed heavily on my mind, particularly when my father and grandfather passed away due to medical errors. All I can say is, I know many of us are courteous. Be an advocate for yourself and your loved ones. You don't want to be that person, but the truth is that individuals are aware of their bodies. If they are adamant that something is wrong, they most likely know more than you. This includes difficult patients, drug users, or just those with low tolerances for being there when your loved ones are in the hospital, or receiving competent nursing will help you notice things that might pass your mind. I know this is a difficult thing to accomplish, but suffering and discomfort shouldn't be dismissed or overlooked through the cracks. Otherwise, I discovered a body on my way to work in the days before the cell phone. I started at 5 in the morning, and I would, weather permitting. I occasionally ride my bike to work. Since it was supposed to be a warm day, I set out on my bike. With no traffic, I could cruise along very nicely. I was about to enter an underpass when I noticed someone lying on the road. A drunk fell off the pavement and passed out. And when I slowed down, I noticed a large trail of blood. I got off my bike to check on them, but their eyes were half open, and their brain matter told me that there was no phone and no traffic. The first vehicle to arrive was a taxi. Great. He has a radio and will contact the police. However, when he sees me jumping up and down and waving my arms close to someone who is down, he applies the brakes, makes a quick U-turn, and gets out of there. A vehicle arrives from the opposite direction a few minutes later, and he does the same thing. A car then pulls up, and an elderly man asks, "What's up?" I tell him that someone needs to call the police since that person is dead. He says he has to go to work and will probably call the police from there, and went. a block away. I managed to flag down a police car 10 minutes later. An ambulance arrives at the same moment, and I ask the officers and EMTs if anyone called them. They say no, so I'm interviewed, tell my story, and I'm sent on my way. Later that week, an officer called to inform me of what happened. It turns out that a 23-year-old woman was living on the streets at a difficult time, and her family claims she was hurting herself because she was a child who tried suicide. Before jumping off the overpass onto the pavement below, it was a very tragic circumstance, and I worked with her cousin for nearly a year after that. I've never discussed this since, before, and I'm happy I did, even if it had been on Reddit. I'm always terrified of situations like this, and I doubt I'd know what to do. Additionally, being the first person to discover a body would mean that the police would undoubtedly question you and be called in to testify in court hearings or investigations based on the case. That sounds like too much stress for someone like me, and I've also watched so much JBS that I've longed to leave, but that was in 1989, and I still think about her every time I travel that way. The police were quite professional and kind to both her and me. It's the folks who did nothing that I have to worry about. When I was 12 years old, I was riding my bike beside the river in my small hamlet when a fisherman discovered a suitcase. Being a curious child, I went to take a look, and when he opened it, I couldn't adequately express the filth I witnessed. Although bones were apparent, you wouldn't have guessed it was a human inside. The police arrived and conducted an investigation, eventually determining that the body was that of a 70-year-old man from a nearby county who had vanished a month earlier. Before his son killed him, he was sliced up and put into several suitcases. Only one of them was discovered. I started at 5 in the morning, and I would, weather permitting. I occasionally ride my bike to work. Since it was supposed to be a warm day, I set out on my bike. With no traffic, I could cruise along very nicely. I was about to enter an underpass when I noticed someone lying on the road. A drunk fell off the pavement and passed out. And when I slowed down, I noticed a large trail of blood. I got off my bike to check on them, but their eyes were half open, and their brain matter told me that there was no phone and no traffic. The first vehicle to arrive was a taxi. Great. He has a radio and will contact the police. However, when he sees me jumping up and down and waving my arms close to someone who is down, he applies the brakes, makes a quick U-turn, and gets out of there. A vehicle arrives from the opposite direction a few minutes later, and he does the same thing. A car then pulls up, and an elderly man asks, "What's up?" I tell him that someone needs to call the police since that person is dead. He says he has to go to work and will probably call the police from there, and went a block away. I managed to flag down a police car 10 minutes later. An ambulance arrives at the same moment, and I ask the officers and EMTs if anyone called them. They say no, so I'm interviewed, tell my story, and I'm sent on my way. Later that week, an officer called to inform me of what happened. It turns out that a 23-year-old woman was living on the streets at a difficult time, and her family claims she was hurting herself because she was a child who tried suicide. Before jumping off the overpass onto the pavement below, it was a very tragic circumstance, and I worked with her cousin for nearly a year after that. I've never discussed this since, before, and I'm happy I did, even if it had been on Reddit. I'm always terrified of situations like this, and I doubt I'd know what to do. Additionally, being the first person to discover a body would mean that the police would undoubtedly question you and be called in to testify in court hearings or investigations based on the case. That sounds like too much stress for someone like me, and I've also watched so much JBS that I've longed to leave, but that was in 1989, and I still think about her every time I travel that way. The police were quite professional and kind to both her and me. It's the folks who did nothing that I have to worry about. When I was 12 years old, I was riding my bike beside the river in my small hamlet when a fisherman discovered a suitcase. Being a curious child, I went to take a look, and when he opened it, I couldn't adequately express the filth I witnessed. Although bones were apparent, you wouldn't have guessed it was a human inside. The police arrived and conducted an investigation, eventually determining that the body was that of a 70-year-old man from a nearby county who had vanished a month earlier. Before his son killed him, he was sliced up and put into several suitcases. Only one of them was discovered, and it was about 50 miles from the place where they had been discarded. I can't say that affected me in the least, but I probably would have when I was a neighborhood child in kindergarten, perhaps a grade or two above me. Discovered a dead woman in the woods above our homes. He told a few adults, but no one took him seriously for days. Later, someone else discovered the woman, who had been raped. I discovered a dead man on my way to work. The child could not cope with the memory of that well. Turned to drugs later in life, and from what I've heard, took his own life. However, that is heresy, and I'm not sure if it's true. Manchester has several ancient mill buildings that are repurposed as offices, shops, bars, hashtags, etc., and I was heading to work after parking a little way from the entrance. New Hampshire is in the middle of a chilly winter, possibly early or mid-January. From a distance, I thought it was to garbage bags, but when I got closer, I saw it was I didn't give it much thought and continued about halfway to work. I noticed that there was no steam coming from my breathing. Worried, stepped back and began yelling at the unresponsive guy. I went to work and dialed 911 since I had no idea what else to do and didn't have a cell phone at the time. This was a dispatcher in the early 2000s, claimed that some people were en route. I walked to the nearest location and waved at a police officer and an ambulance. They said I was the one who called, directed them to the man, and asked if I could leave. They concluded he was dead, so I assumed I went to work. I don't know how he got there, but he may have been homeless. I didn't get a good look at him other than telling you that he was a dark-haired adult man. I told the cop where I worked if they needed me, and then I went to work. My commute is 3.5 blocks, and I'm certain that I'll eventually find someone dead on it. Manchester is undoubtedly the most up city I've ever lived in. This year, I acquired the Narcan training, and I'm going to start carrying it. I used to run a hotel, and I once came into a room where a man was supposed to have checked out and discovered that he had hung himself, most likely the night before. Yachtals are so busy that this all took so long that I didn't have time to react or think about it until the police arrived. I phoned the police, made sure the cleaning crew didn't enter that room, and gave a statement once they arrived. At the end of my shift, I parked my car, tried to get out, and just puked in the parking lot while crying. He was already rigid and showed signs of rigor mortis, windows for months, and I've been drinking a lot ever since. I still have a lot of PTSD, and it's still the worst time of my life. Watching hanging scenes in TV shows and movies makes me perspire. I have found two bodies, parts in my life. The first is simple and uninspiring. I was pouring concrete for a building slab that would be next to a large hay field. I spoke with the farmer a few times, and he told me he enjoys relaxing in the shade by the pond when he's cutting hay. A few days pass, and as our project draws to a close, he begins cutting hay. We waved at him as we left the job site for the day, and the next day we arrived, and the second occasion was when I went fishing and suspiciously caught a shoe with the foot still in it. His tractor was on its side, and when another man and I raced over, the old man was dead below it, appearing to have bled to death. My grandfather had a ranch in East Texas, and he would mow hay 2 or 3 times a year. Those mowers can be brutal. I phoned the police, and they came out, took my statement, cut the line, and confiscated the foot along with one of my favorite lures. People up there were as tough as old hickory. Charlie, his 80-year-old neighbor, was mowing when he suffered a heart attack and fell off the tractor, becoming entangled in the machine. Charlie's son saw, but it was too late. Grandpa simply told us what had happened when he arrived. My brothers and I were teenagers at the time, and I recall asking about him. He had a raven that could perform the opening lines of the Yellow Rose of Texas. When a former leasing agent entered a studio apartment, the tenant had wrapped the cable from a bike and nailed a heavy-duty ceiling hook into a 2x4 so the hook was dangling through the roof on some metal shelf. When I opened the door, he was against the left wall and about 6 feet away from me, with his back to me. The entryway was about as wide as a regular door, so I closed the lock around the hook, then over his neck, and knelt into it. I phoned my boss and explained what had happened, and he called the police on my behalf. I returned inside and shouted hello twice before telling the person there to come look at the apartment and walking them outside, or 3 times as I approached him, although I could see his eyes were open and yet not moving. I could also see his left hand curled under the cable. I had always pondered whether that was a last-minute remorse or a survival reflex. The person who was there for the showing stayed and comforted me, telling me that she had similarly discovered her mother. Then the property manager arrived. Finally, I touched his arm, and it was like a shotgun blast back to reality, and I gave him access to the unit so he could verify it. A short while later, the police arrived and declared it was obvious it was, so I was allowed to leave. Friends in that building informed me that they had spoken to him the previous evening. I've struggled with depression, and I've been on edge for most of my life, and that year was very difficult for me. I think about that man a lot, as well as the woman who stayed behind to comfort me. That was the day's first showing, and I ended up. Edit. I finally consented to complete my 10-hour shift. The apartment had been off the market for 2 weeks, and I was the first person to return to show it. It was also the first time I entered his family's household. I left the real estate industry shortly after that. What sort of heartless business would force a worker to finish a shift after discovering a dead body? I believe that you have a legal right to at least the remainder of the day off, but at least ethically, someone would say, yeah, I believe she's done for the day, Jesus. I'm so sorry you went through that. Thank you. I'm glad to still be here, still prone to focus on the bad things. But life is so much better now. It was a tiny company, and there were only a few of us there that day. My coworker happened to stop by the office for a little while, and I was asked whether I was all right to finish the day, and since I didn't want to bother anyone, I said yes. My coworker then left, so I should have explained that I couldn't finish the day, but everything worked out fine. I was in charge of an irrigation project to line the earth and concrete ditches in Nevada. We were in a somewhat isolated part of the state in 2016. In any case, the construction workers I hired to dig a section of the ditch discovered a complete skeleton. We were on one of the ditch's side banks. I mean, the entire skull and ribs were in plain sight. I had to stop everything and call the local police department, and the Reno forensics team came and removed the remains before we could start working on the project again. They conducted a sweep of the area for almost a week. To be honest, seeing that in person was a little unsettling and eerie. From what I understood, it was a cold case involving Reno mobsters from the 1960s, because there was no law enforcement on Indian reservations in those days. The casinos used to take people there and get rid of them. The thought of all the bodies out there truly frightens me. God knows if I've ever passed someone decaying in the ground and been unaware of it. Locals frequently mentioned that the region was eerie at night, as if they were being watched. I was 11 years old when I was playing in the woods with my friends on a bright, cold autumn day. There were 4 of us, 3 boys and a girl, and after that scary discovery, I realized what they meant and had shivers. Girl, someone left their doll out here. We were strolling down a fairly well-traveled path between 2 neighborhoods when the girl stated that. We approached the doll, who was wearing jeans, coveralls, and sneakers, and a child's jacket. She had brown shoulder-length hair that was slightly curly, like many young children's hair, and was on her side, kind of curled up, but her face was down, so we could only see one eye, one cheek, and one ear. The girl in our group, who was around 3 or 4 years old, once knelt, shook her shoulder, and said, "Hey, kid." Nothing happened. We all kind of glanced at each other after that, and one of us didn't. We all simply left the child behind and kept glancing back because, as you may recall, there was a payphone on the street at the end of the walkway in the direction we had been going. We should call 911. When we reached the phone, I had to explain it to the person on the line 3 or 4 times before they kind of believed me and told me they were sending out an officer. He pulled up around 5 minutes after I had placed the call till she was out of sight. After a few minutes, after glancing at each of our faces, the policeman asked, "Where is she?" We pointed down the walkway, and one of the men said, "You can't miss her," instructed us to remain where we were, and he continued walking down the trail. 10 minutes later, A second squad vehicle drove by, blaring lights and sirens, and the entire area became a circus. The four of us children just kind of strolled. I saw on the television that evening that a young girl had disappeared from a few miles away the day before, and it was reported that she had perished from exposure. I still think about it occasionally and become depressed over it, and this made me cry, as I believe I am an adult with children of my own. Concerning it and getting strangled as a child, I believe we were all simply numb at the moment. I didn't tell my parents since I was a little afraid I'd get into trouble for some reason. For this reason, children are still stupid nowadays. I've never discussed it with them. Our names were never taken by the police, and once they had located the girl and had their hands full,